She stood in the mahogany-paneled courtroom, clutching a single crumpled dollar bill and a quitclaim deed. Her billionaire ex-husband smirked, handing her a supposedly toxic, worthless strip of land as a final insult. He thought he had left her destitute. He had actually just handed her the keys to his family's greatest hidden empire. The gavel came down with a hollow, sickening thud. Inside the echoing chamber of the New York County Supreme Court, the sound finalized the absolute financial ruin of Sidney Jenkins. Judgment granted. Honorable Judge Leonard Rossi murmured, adjusting his glasses and looking down at Sidney with a fleeting gaze of judicial pity. The dissolution of marriage is finalized. Assets have been distributed according to the binding prenuptial agreement and the offshore disclosures provided. Sidney sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. Beside her, her overwhelmed, overworked pro bono attorney quietly gathered his files. Across the aisle sat Preston Harrington, the man she had loved, supported, and built a life with for 12 years. Preston looked impeccable in a custom Tom Ford suit. His posture relaxed, exuding the untouchable arrogance of a man who had just legally robbed the mother of his child. Next to him sat his lead counsel, Campbell Wright, a senior partner at the ruthless corporate law firm, Kirkland & Ellis. Preston had made his fortune in proprietary trading software. When they married, they were both broke college students, eating instant ramen in a basement in Brooklyn. But as Preston's algorithms caught the attention of Wall Street, his wealth had exploded into the billions. With the money came the late nights, the unexplained absences, and eventually the highly publicized affair with Penelope Croft, a 23-year-old heiress and socialite. When Sidney filed for divorce, she didn't want his empire. She just wanted a fair share to secure a stable future for their 8-year-old son, Finn. But Preston was a man who hated losing. To him, the divorce was not a separation. It was a hostile takeover, using a labyrinth of shell companies, blind trusts situated in the Cook Islands, and accounts sheltered by the South Sound Trust Company in the Caymans. Preston and his army of lawyers successfully argued that he technically owned almost nothing on paper. The massive penthouse on Central Park West, owned by an LLC. The Hamptons estate, a corporate retreat. Under the ironclad prenuptial agreement she had naively signed at 22, Sidney was entitled to virtually nothing if the marriage dissolved. Campbell Wright stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, as a final gesture of goodwill, my client would like to transfer full ownership of an independent real estate asset to Ms. Jenkins. It is a family holding unencumbered by any corporate debt. We have the quitclaim deed ready for transfer." The judge raised an eyebrow. "An asset? I don't see this in the primary discovery, Mr. Wright." "It is a minor personal holding, Your Honor. Plot 4B, located in the Cold Spring Ravine of the Hudson Valley. My client wishes to gift it to Ms. Jenkins to ensure she is not left entirely without property." Sidney's lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Take it. It's land. Even if it's upstate, you can sell it. It's better than the zero we're currently looking at." Numb and exhausted from 18 months of litigation, Sidney nodded. A bailiff brought over the heavy cream-colored parchment. Attached to it was a fresh quitclaim deed, and stapled to the front was a single crisp $1 bill. "Consider it a buyout, Val," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension as he leaned across the wooden divider. "The property was assessed last year. It's landlocked, legally inaccessible for commercial development, and sits next to an old industrial runoff site. Its legal market value is exactly $1. But hey, now you're a landowner. Don't say I never gave you anything." He turned and walked out of the courtroom, Penelope waiting for him in the gallery, dripping in diamonds that Sidney's suffering had paid for. 3 weeks later, the reality of her new life set in. Sydney was living in a cramped, drafty, one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens. The hum of a failing refrigerator provided the soundtrack to her sleepless nights. She had traded a life of private jets and galas for clipping coupons and dodging calls from Con Edison. She had taken a job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic, but the pay barely covered Finn's asthma medication and the exorbitant New York rent. One rainy Tuesday evening, after putting Finn to sleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, Sydney sat at the tiny Formica kitchen table. Piled before her were final notice bills, a bank statement showing a balance of $142.16, and the legal folder from the divorce. She opened the folder and pulled out the quitclaim deed. She stared at the $1 bill Preston had maliciously attached to it. It was a symbol of her worth in his eyes, a piece of literal dirt. But as the cheap fluorescent kitchen light hit the heavy parchment of the original deed behind the modern quitclaim, something caught her eye. The modern paperwork filed by Kirkland and Ellis was standard, sterile legalese. But the older document attached to the back, the chain of title, was a thick, yellowed piece of vellum, dated October 14, 1922. It bore a faded, embossed seal, Fidelity Title and Trust Company, the Hawthorne Consortium. Sydney frowned, tracing her finger over the faded ink. Why would Preston's high-tech modern portfolio include an isolated scrap of land from 1922? Preston's family wasn't old money. His grandfather had been a mid-level banker, and Preston had built his own wealth. Where did this come from? Desperation breeds curiosity. Sydney knew that even the worst plots of land in the Hudson Valley had timber, or perhaps could be sold to an adjacent property owner to expand their yard. If she could get even $5,000 for it, it would keep her and Finn afloat for a few months. She pulled out her laptop, an old whirring machine, and typed the coordinates listed on the deed into Google Maps. The screen zoomed into a dense green blur just off Route 9W, near the historic town of Cold Spring. There were no roads leading to it, no street view, just a harsh, unmarked topographical drop-off. "Plot 4B, she whispered to the empty room. "What exactly did you give me, Preston?" On Saturday morning, Sydney borrowed her neighbor's beat-up 2008 Honda Civic, promising to fill the gas tank in exchange for the favor. With Finn securely buckled in the back seat, playing on a cracked tablet, she drove north on the Taconic State Parkway. The skyline of Manhattan faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering autumn-painted trees of the Hudson Valley. The drive took nearly 2 hours. Following the GPS coordinates on her phone, she turned off the main highway onto a winding, unpaved logging road that hadn't seen fresh gravel in decades. The Honda rattled violently over the ruts, its suspension groaning in protest. Finally, the road simply ended at a massive wall of untamed blackberry brambles and twisting ivy. "Are we camping, Mum?" Finn asked, peering out the window at the dense, intimidating forest. "No, honey. Mummy just needs to check on something," Sydney said, forcing a reassuring smile. She stepped out of the car into the crisp, damp air. Before her stood a towering, rust-eaten chain-link fence. Hanging haphazardly by a single loop of wire was a faded, weather-beaten metal sign. Warning. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Contaminated soil. No trespassing. The sign looked old, easily from the 1980s. Preston's words echoed in her mind. Sits next to an old industrial runoff site. Its legal market value is exactly $1. Sydney felt a heavy knot form in her stomach. He was right. It was a toxic dump. She had wasted $20 in gas just to look at a poisoned patch of dirt. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She kicked a loose rock toward the fence, ready to turn around and surrender to her miserable reality. But as the rock struck the base of the fence, it moved a thick curtain of dead ivy, revealing something underneath. Sydney froze. She walked closer, crouching down in the wet leaves. Half buried in the earth was a massive ornate stone pillar. It wasn't the kind of concrete piling you'd find at an industrial site. It was hand-carved limestone, reminiscent of the Gilded Age mansions in Newport or the Vanderbilt's estates. Embedded in the center of the stone was a heavy bronze crest, entirely green with oxidation, but still legible. It depicted a roaring lion intertwined with an oak tree, and beneath it, engraved in Latin, were the words Aeternum Custodi Guard, for eternity. Sydney brushed the dirt away from the base of the pillar. Why would an EPA toxic waste dump have a 19th century aristocratic crest guarding its entrance? "Mum, it's cold," Finn called from the car. "Just a minute, baby." Sydney said, her heart suddenly beating faster. She pulled out her phone and snapped several high-resolution photos of the crest, the fence, and the faded EPA sign. Instead of driving back to Queens, Sydney steered the Honda toward the town center of Cold Spring. She found the Putnam County Historical Society and Archives, situated in a converted brick schoolhouse on Main Street. Leaving Finn in the children's reading corner with a stack of comic books, she approached the front desk. Sitting behind a mountain of dusty plat maps and property ledgers was an elderly man with wild white hair, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, and a pair of thick reading glasses resting on the tip of his nose. His nameplate read, Eugene Gallagher, Head Archivist. "Excuse me," Sydney said, placing her phone on the counter to show the photo of the bronze crest. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about this. I found it off Route 9W. Eugene squinted at the screen. He adjusted his glasses, leaned in, and then abruptly pulled back his eyes, widening in sheer disbelief. He looked up at Sydney as if she had just produced a live dinosaur. "Where did you get this picture?" Eugene asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "I took it an hour ago. I own the land. It was given to me in a divorce settlement." Eugene stared at her, utterly bewildered. "You own Parcel 4, the Hawthorne Keyhole." "I own Plot 4, Bay," Sydney corrected, pulling the folded 1922 deed from her purse and laying it on the counter. "My ex-husband's lawyers said it was a toxic strip worth $1. Eugene didn't touch the paper immediately. He just stared at the embossed seal of the Fidelity Title and Trust Company. A slow, incredulous smile began to stretch across his wrinkled face. "Your ex-husband, is he by any chance related to the Harrington banking family?" "Yes," Sydney said, confused. "Preston Harrington. His grandfather was a banker." Eugene let out a loud, echoing laugh that startled a few people browsing in the next room. "Oh dear God in heaven! The arrogance of modern corporate lawyers. They rely so much on digital records and offshore spreadsheets that they never bother to read the physical history of the dirt they stand on." He motioned for Sydney to follow him. "Come with me, Mrs. Harrington." "Jenkins," she corrected firmly. "Ms. Jenkins, let me show you what your ex-husband just threw away." Eugene led her into a back room lined with towering steel filing cabinets. He pulled open a heavy drawer labeled 1900 to 1930 Land Trusts and extracted a massive leather-bound ledger. He slammed it onto a reading table, sending a cloud of dust into the air, and flipped through the heavy yellowed pages until he found a map. It was a hand-drawn cartography map from 1922, showing a massive swath of the Hudson Valley. In 1919, Eugene began tracing a finger over a massive green area on the map. A consortium of Gilded Age tycoons, associates of the Astor and Vanderbilt families, purchased 4,000 acres of virgin timberland mountains and pristine lakes here in the valley. They called it the Hawthorne Reserve. It was meant to be a private utopia, a retreat for the mega-rich. But the Great Depression hit, and the consortium went bankrupt. The land was locked into an irrevocable trust to prevent the government from seizing it for back taxes. Sydney looked at the map. The The Hawthorne Reserve was massive, but right at the very edge of the vast green expanse was a tiny red sliver of land. "What does this have to do with my $1 deed?" she asked. "Everything," Eugene said, tapping the red sliver. To protect the 4,000-acre reserve, the trust's architects did something incredibly cunning. They created a legal chokehold. They carved out a half-acre strip of land at the very entrance of the valley, the only geographical access point, due to the surrounding mountains and the Hudson River. "This is Parcel 4B, the keyhole." Eugene turned the page of the ledger revealing dense legal text. According to the Hawthorne Trust Charter of 1922, the 4,000 acres of the reserve cannot be sold, developed, or liquidated unless the action is unilaterally approved by the title holder of Parcel 4B. Furthermore, the deed holder of 4B retains the exclusive subterranean riparian and mineral rights to the entire reserve. Sydney felt the air leave her lungs. "Wait, you're saying—" "I'm saying," Eugene interrupted, his eyes gleaming with excitement, "that your ex-husband's grandfather, the banker, was the executor of this dormant trust. In the 1980s, developers were sniffing around. To protect the land and hide it from state tax assessors, the grandfather slapped a fake EPA warning on the front gate of Parcel 4B to scare people away and let the property value technically drop to zero on paper. The modern lawyers looked at the digital tax rolls, saw a $1 valuation next to a toxic waste site, and threw it into your divorce settlement as a joke." Eugene pointed a trembling finger at Sydney's deed. "They didn't give you a toxic waste dump, Ms. Jenkins. They accidentally gave you the master key to a completely untouched 4,000-acre estate just 50 miles from Manhattan. The timber alone is worth $30 million. The land value is astronomical. But that's not even the best part." Sydney gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "There's more. The Hawthorne Trust wasn't just dirt," Eugene whispered. "It was funded. To pay the minimal property taxes for a century, the consortium endowed the trust with blue-chip stocks in 1922. Standard Oil, American Telephone and Telegraph, U.S. Steel. Those shares have been sitting in a dormant escrow account at J.P. Morgan Chase, compounding dividends untouched for over 80 years, quietly paying the pennies needed to keep the lights off." Eugene looked Sydney dead in the eye. "And according to the charter, the holder of the Parcel 4B deed has the sole legal authority to dissolve the trust and claim the endowment." Sydney looked down at the crumpled $1 bill Preston had clipped to the deed. It was meant to break her. It was meant to be the final word in a story where she lost everything. Instead, in the dusty silence of the county archives, Sydney Jenkins realized she had just become one of the wealthiest women in the state of New York. And Preston Harrington had no idea what he had just done. Sydney knew she could not fight Kirkland and Ellis with the exhausted, overworked pro bono attorney from her divorce proceedings. She needed a predator. She needed someone who understood the dark, intricate machinery of corporate wealth preservation. She found that predator in Harrison Hayes, a disgraced former corporate litigator who now ran a boutique financial fraud practice out of a cramped, cigarette smoke-stained office in Midtown Manhattan. Harrison had a notorious reputation for being ruthless, brilliant, and harboring a deep personal vendetta against Campbell Wright, his former law school rival. When Sydney laid the 1922 Hawthorne Trust Charter, the modern quitclaim deed, and Eugene Gallagher's archival map onto Harrison's scratched glass desk, the lawyer stopped breathing. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, pulling the documents closer to his desk lamp. He spent 3 grueling hours authenticating the documents, cross-referencing the seals with the state registry online, and pacing his tiny office. When he finally looked up, his hands were visibly shaking. "They handed you a loaded gun," Harrison whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and predatory glee. "And they didn't realize the safety was off." The first crucial step was securing the dormant endowment. On a brisk Thursday morning, Sidney and Harrison walked into the towering global headquarters of J.P. Morgan Chase at 383 Madison Avenue. They bypassed the standard teller lines and were directed to the elite wealth management division on the 42nd floor. A polished executive director named William Croft, ironically the uncle of Preston's new fiancée, Penelope, greeted them with a distinctly patronizing smile. "Ms. Jenkins, I assure you, dormant escrow accounts from the 1920s are notoriously difficult to trace, and most have been absorbed by state escheatment laws. Furthermore, we require original signatory authorization, which is impossible given the age of the trust," Croft explained condescendingly, barely glancing at her file. Harrison cut him off, sliding the heavy wax-sealed vellum deed across the polished mahogany conference table. Pursuant to the 1922 Fidelity Title Charter, the physical deed holder of Parcel 4B acts as the sole authorized executor of the entire estate. We are executing a full immediate dissolution of the Hawthorne Trust endowment. Produce the master ledger. William or I file a writ of mandamus in federal court before you finish your morning espresso. Croft scoffed, but he reluctantly took the document back to his compliance team. Sidney and Harrison waited in tense, suffocating silence. An hour later, Croft returned. His patronizing smile was completely gone. His face was the color of wet ash. Behind him stood the bank's senior legal counsel, looking deeply panicked. "The escrow account is active," Croft said, his voice trembling slightly as he avoided Sidney's gaze. "The original principal was $50,000 in 1922, invested entirely in Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, and General Electric. Through a century of stock splits, dividend reinvestments, and corporate mergers." Croft swallowed hard, looking at his clipboard. "The current liquid valuation of the portfolio is $247,600,000. Sidney's vision blurred. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. 247 million. "We will begin the transfer protocols to a new private holding account immediately," Ms. Jenkins, the bank's counsel, added, hastily terrified of a massive lawsuit over a delayed payout of this magnitude. While Sidney quietly secured the cash empire, the trap was rapidly closing around Preston Harrington. Preston's proprietary algorithmic trading firm, Harrington Algorithmic, had secretly suffered a catastrophic quarter. To cover a massive institutional margin, call and appease his furious board of directors, Preston needed liquid capital immediately. He confidently instructed his wealth managers to initiate a quiet, off-the-books liquidation of the Hawthorne Reserve, his family's heavily guarded secret asset. He already had a private buyer, a massive luxury resort developer, ready to pay $1.2 billion for the pristine 4,000 acres of untouched wilderness in the Hudson Valley. But when Campbell Wright filed the preliminary dissolution papers for the Hawthorne Trust, the New York State Land Registry violently rejected them. Preston stormed into Campbell's corner office at Kirkland, and Ellis hurling his leather briefcase against the frosted glass wall. "What do you mean we can't sell the reserve? My grandfather locked that land up for exactly this scenario. Fix it." Campbell Wright, usually unflappable and composed, looked physically ill. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie loose. He pointed a shaking finger to a highlighted section of a digital land registry file on his monitor. "Preston, we can't dissolve the trust. We don't hold the controlling deed anymore." "What are you talking about?" "It's all in the offshore holding company in the Caymans," Preston shouted, slamming his hands on the desk. No, Campbell said, his voice cracking with pure dread. The master key to the Hawthorne Trust. Parcel 4B, the keyhole. Preston's stomach dropped into an abyss. He stared at his lawyer, his mind racing to connect the dots. The toxic strip, the one with the EPA sign. It was never toxic, Preston. Your grandfather faked that signage to keep developers and trespassers away. And because it looked like a worthless, liability-heavy strip of dirt on the modern digital tax rolls, we used it as the throwaway physical asset in your divorce settlement to satisfy the judge. Sydney owns it. Legally, she owns the access rights, the subterranean mineral rights, and the absolute sole authority to liquidate the entire 4,000-acre reserve. Without her signature, that billion-dollar land is utterly useless to you. Preston collapsed heavily into a leather chair, the blood rapidly draining from his face. The reality of his catastrophic arrogance washed over him like ice water. She has the keyhole, Preston whispered into the quiet office. She has the $1 deed. Desperation makes powerful men reckless. Preston Harrington filed an immediate aggressive emergency injunction in the New York County Supreme Court, attempting to unilaterally void the quitclaim deed. His frantic legal filing claimed a clerical error and fraudulent misrepresentation by the plaintiff. 3 months after their divorce was finalized, Sydney found herself walking back into the exact same mahogany-paneled courtroom. But the dynamic had violently shifted. This time she was not the terrified, destitute mother, drowning in cheap blazers and unpaid electrical bills. She wore a tailored midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit. Harrison Hayes sat beside her, radiating the calm, lethal, unbothered energy of a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. Across the aisle, Preston looked haggard and broken. The immense stress of his failing company and the impending, very public loss of a billion-dollar family secret had aged him 5 years in 3 months. Penelope Croft sat in the gallery, no longer looking smug, but scowling deeply. Her massive diamond engagement ring suddenly looked conspicuously heavy on her finger. Honorable Judge Leonard Rossi surveyed the packed courtroom, reading over the injunction filings, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance. "Mr. Wright," Judge Rossi said, his tone dripping with judicial skepticism, "you are asking this court to reverse a quitclaim deed that you yourself drafted, presented, and executed in this very room just 90 days ago. You explicitly claimed it was an act of goodwill." "Your Honor." Campbell Wright began, sweating profusely and gripping the podium to steady his shaking hands. The defense was entirely unaware of the historical century-old encumbrances attached to Parcel 4B Ms. Jenkins opportunistically exploited a clerical oversight regarding a dormant, forgotten family trust. This was a catastrophic clerical mistake. Harrison Hayes stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket with dramatic precision. "Your Honor, the sheer arrogance of opposing counsel is not a legally recognized clerical error. Mr. Harrington intentionally, maliciously hid his true assets during the divorce discovery phase. He actively used offshore accounts in the Cook Islands to feign poverty. He mockingly handed my client a plot of land he believed to be a toxic waste dump, attaching a literal $1 bill to the deed to humiliate her in front of this very court." Harrison confidently walked over to the evidence podium and dropped a massive, heavy binder onto the wood. "Furthermore, the defense is blatantly lying about the asset being dormant. We have successfully subpoenaed the financial records of the Hawthorne Trust escrow account at J.P. Morgan Chase. Mr. Harrington's grandfather, and subsequently Mr. Harrington himself, knew exactly what this trust was worth. He attempted to illegally liquidate the 4,000-acre reserve last week to cover margin calls for his failing algorithmic trading firm, only to realize he had accidentally handed my client the master key." Judge Rossi's eyes widened significantly as he quickly reviewed the bank records Harrison submitted. The judge looked down at Preston Harrington with absolute, unmasked disgust. "Mr. Harrington," Judge Rossi said, his voice echoing like thunder in the quiet courtroom, "you willfully attempted to defraud this court. You attempted to leave your former wife and your own young child destitute while sitting on $1 billion hidden asset. You thought you were being incredibly clever by weaponizing a piece of land you believed to be worthless. Instead, you have decisively hoisted yourself by your own petard." The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down. "Injunction unequivocally denied. The quitclaim deed remains absolute, fully executed, and legally binding. Furthermore, I am independently forwarding the transcripts of this hearing directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding your undisclosed attempts to liquidate restricted trust assets to cover corporate debts. We are permanently adjourned." Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a hollow, defeated sound. He was financially ruined. Without the Hawthorne land to leverage as collateral, his company would completely default by Friday morning. He had lost absolutely everything. Sydney walked out of the courtroom, the crisp, cool autumn air of Manhattan hitting her face. She didn't bother to look back at Preston or his defeated team of lawyers. She had a magnificent new life to build. 6 months later, Sydney Jenkins stood proudly on the edge of the Hawthorne Reserve. The rusted chain-link fence and the fake, terrifying EPA sign were permanently gone, replaced by a beautiful, soaring wrought-iron gate bearing the original lion and oak crest. She had firmly refused to sell the 4,000 acres to the aggressive resort developers. Instead, she utilized a fraction of her newly acquired $240 million cash endowment to establish the Hawthorne Conservation Foundation, permanently protecting the pristine Hudson Valley timberland from corporate destruction forever. She built a stunning, modern architectural eco-home nestled on the edge of the reserve for herself and Finn. Finn now attended the most elite private academy in the state, his chronic asthma completely cleared up by the fresh, unpolluted mountain air. Sydney had also quietly, anonymously, bought out the struggling dental clinic in Queens, where she used to work, giving the entire staff massive salary raises and transforming it into a free community health center for low-income families. Preston Harrington's firm predictably went bankrupt. Penelope Croft left him abruptly, shortly after the SEC formally froze his remaining personal assets. He currently lived in a small rented condominium in New Jersey, completely drowning in legal fees and federal IRS audits. Sydney stood on the expansive cedar porch of her new home, sipping a hot cup of coffee, as she watched the golden sun rise over the majestic, sweeping peaks of her 4,000-acre kingdom. She reached into the pocket of her luxurious cashmere cardigan and pulled out a small, elegantly framed object. It was the crumpled $1 bill. She kept it proudly on display, not as a reminder of her past pain, but as a permanent monument to her ultimate triumph. It was, without a doubt, the best investment she had ever made. Sydney went from being pushed to the absolute brink to becoming the ultimate architect of her own destiny, outsmarting the very people who tried to break her. If you loved this deeply satisfying story of karma, hidden wealth, and ultimate revenge, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this incredible real-life drama with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of hidden treasures and shocking twists.